The champagne flute hit the hardwood so hard the entire patio went churchyard silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something unexpected splits the air clean open, like a rifle shot at a funeral. 1 second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard barbecue sauce was threatening his white polo shirt. He snorted loud enough for half the yard to hear. "Let me guess," he wheezed, wiping his eye. "They called you princess." I took one slow sip of iced tea before answering. "Hades." That was it, one word, flat as a West Texas road. But the retired Navy SEAL, standing near the outdoor bar, a man who'd probably faced things that would turn most people's hair white overnight, dropped his champagne glass like he'd just seen something step out of a nightmare he thought he'd buried years ago. He stared at me, pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid at the exact same time. "No," he whispered. Then he stood straight, squared his shoulders, and saluted me, right there, in front of my entire family, between the potato salad and the cooler full of imported beer. That was the precise moment my cousin Rick realized he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. The barbecue was supposed to be nothing, just one afternoon. My Aunt Donna's 75th birthday out near Waco, Texas. Folding chairs, country music bleeding from old speakers, men arguing about football beside smokers full of brisket, grandkids running laps with popsicles melting down their wrists in the August heat. Real, ordinary American life. I almost didn't come. Truth is, I hadn't attended one of these gatherings in close to 8 years. Families have long memories, especially for the embarrassing things. And in my family, I was mostly filed under strange. The quiet one. The woman who vanished into the army 2 decades ago and never really came all the way back. Most of them assumed I'd pushed paperwork around military offices somewhere forgettable. Maybe filed reports. Maybe organized supply closets. I never corrected them. Easier that way. At 53 years old, I'd learned something most people only absorb after enough funerals. Peace matters more than being understood. But Aunt Donna had called personally. "Claire," she'd said, soft and unhurried over the phone, "I'm getting old, sweetheart. I'd really love to see your face." So I drove the 3 hours. I brought peach cobbler, and I quietly promised myself I'd leave before sunset if Rick started drinking too much. Rick started drinking before noon. My cousin had always been loud in the particular way insecure men usually are. Not evil, just big. The type who believed volume was the same thing as confidence. He sold RVs outside Dallas and treated every conversation like a closing pitch. By the time I arrived, he was already working through a second imported beer and holding court beside the grill like he was accepting an Oscar. "Well, look who crawled out of Area 51, he barked when he spotted me crossing the yard. Half the patio laughed. I smiled politely. "You still alive, Rick?" "Barely. Inflation's finishing what the pandemic started." More laughter. I hugged Aunt Donna, kissed her cheek, helped carry trays from the kitchen while everybody else debated gas prices and the local high school football team's chances this season. Nobody paid me much attention. I preferred it exactly that way. Around 4 o'clock, a black SUV turned slowly into the driveway. Out stepped an older man in a navy blazer despite the heat. Tall, lean, white hair clipped military short, posture like a flagpole. Even before Aunt Donna introduced him, something in the back of my brain registered, combat veteran. It doesn't matter how many years pass or how many suit jackets get layered over the uniform, soldiers carry themselves differently. Something in the spine never quite forgets. "This is Walter Briggs," Aunt Donna announced warmly. "He served alongside Harold years ago. Harold was her late husband, a good man, gone 11 years now." Walter worked his way around the patio shaking hands, easy and unhurried. But when his eyes landed on me, his hand paused mid-reach. Something flickered across his face, recognition, then confusion, then a very careful blankness, like a man who'd seen something he wasn't ready to name yet. I looked away first. I should have known right then that the day was already sliding sideways. By early evening, Rick had upgraded from annoying to a full performance. He'd gathered a small audience near the cooler and was narrating his high school football career like he'd personally declined a Super Bowl invitation due to scheduling conflicts. I was sitting quietly near the patio railing, watching the last sunlight flatten itself gold across the fields beyond Aunt Donna's fence line, when Rick materialized beside me with a fresh beer, and that particular grin men wear when they're about to say something they think is clever. "So, he announced, loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear, "you ever actually do anything dangerous in the army?" "Sometimes." "What's that mean?" "It means sometimes." A few cousins chuckled. Rick grinned wider, encouraged. "You shoot guns and everything?" "Occasionally." "Fight anybody?" His tone had that teasing edge, the kind of gentle needling men use when they think they're backing someone into a corner for sport. I could feel Walter Briggs watching from across the patio, still and quiet as a hunting dog on point. I should have deflected, should have smiled and said a little and let the whole thing drift away like smoke. I'd done it 100 times before. But maybe I was tired. Maybe 20 years of making myself smaller than I was had finally reached some kind of limit I hadn't known existed until that exact moment. "Only hand to hand," I said calmly. "Knives were optional." The circle burst out laughing. Rick slapped the table. Even I smiled just a little into my tea glass. Then he delivered the line. "Let me guess." He was almost crying with laughter. "They called you princess." I looked him directly in the eye. "Hades." The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone the color of old ash. Not the pale of shock, the pale of a man watching something he'd locked away in a dark room suddenly walk back through the door. The old seal stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of sediment. "No damn way," he whispered. Rick blinked. "What?" Walter crossed the patio slowly, deliberately, the way men move when their legs are carrying them somewhere their mind is still catching up to. "You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. "You flew the Kandahar extraction routes." Silence. Walter's breathing changed, something old and heavy shifting behind his eyes. My family looked back and forth between us like they were watching a tennis match being played in a language they didn't speak. Rick forced out a laugh, but it was hollow now. "Okay, somebody want to tell me what's happening here?" Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. "I heard you were dead." The patio had gone absolutely still, except for the distant drone of cicadas beyond the tree line. I set my glass down carefully. "Not dead," I said, "just done." Walter's eyes glistened. He pressed his lips together for a moment. Then, in front of my entire family, between the potato salad and the half-eaten birthday cake, the retired Navy SEAL squared his back, raised his hand to his forehead, and held a salute. For the first time in my living memory, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for a long, thick moment. Not even Rick. And getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a minor miracle under any ordinary circumstances. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oaks while everyone stared at me like I'd grown an additional head while they weren't watching. I hated this. The sudden reappraisal. The recalibration in people's eyes when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way stories made it seem. Mostly it just made me tired in my bones. Rick finally forced out an awkward sound. "Okay, what exactly is going on right now?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me slowly, like a man lowering something fragile. "You got any idea who your cousin is?" he asked Rick. Rick smirked weakly. "Apparently not." Walter nodded once. "No, apparently not." Aunt Donna had moved to my side now, her hand hovering near my arm. "Claire, sweetheart, what is he talking about?" I sighed quietly. "Nothing important." Walter shook his head. "With respect, that's not true." He looked at Rick carefully. "You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs?" "Sure. Most of them are jokes, embarrassing nicknames, stupid stories from training." He paused. "Not that one." Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. The grin was completely gone now. You're serious? Son, Walter said evenly. There were rangers, SEALs, Marines, helicopter pilots, men who went home to their families because of her. Men who would have been left in the ground. The patio was quiet except for the music still drifting from the old speakers. Somewhere, a child dropped something and started crying, but even that seemed far away. Come on, Rick said, softer now. You're making her sound like fiction. Walter's expression hardened. Rambo was fiction, this wasn't. That shut him up completely. Aunt Donna sat beside me and laced her fingers gently through mine. Claire, what did you do over there? I looked down at my hands for a moment. At my age, your hands tell the real story long before your mouth gets around to it. Scars, old burns, a finger that healed slightly crooked after a fracture that never got properly set. I flew medevac support, I said. Walter corrected me immediately. You flew blacks on. E-extraction. I closed my eyes briefly. Most civilians imagine military pilots in a certain way. The movies have done their work well. Flags and speeches and clean heroics. Real war is mostly exhaustion stacked on top of terror, inside a vibrating metal machine where every sound means something and every second costs something. Helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel it in your teeth, in your stomach, in the base of your skull. Kandahar, Walter murmured. Fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. What happened in Kandahar? Walter looked out toward the dark fields beyond the fence. The mission came apart at the seams. His voice had dropped into a different register now. Quieter, older. SEAL recon team got ambushed outside the city while moving toward the extraction point. Sandstorm rolling in. Visibility collapsing to nothing. Enemy fighters cutting off the route. He paused. Command ordered all air support to pull back. The circle had gone completely still. But one pilot, Walter said slowly, ignored the order. I stared at my untouched tea. That wasn't bravery, I said quietly. It was anger. Walter shook his head. No, it was the only thing that mattered. I almost said something, but the memory was already coming back, unwelcome and precise, the way bad memories always are. The radio dissolving into static, the altimeter spinning, the sky turning the color of a bruise. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said finally. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy positions, could barely read my own instruments. Rick had gone very still, and you still landed. Hardest landing of my life. The helicopter had already taken 2 hits before she touched down, Walter added quietly. Aunt Donna made a small sound beside me. Her hand tightened around mine. The SEAL team was carrying their wounded when I landed, one man missing most of his left leg, another barely conscious. We loaded everyone we could reach. Then an RPG hit close, too close, and the fire started. Walter nodded once, and she still lifted off. Overloaded, half-blind, enemy vehicles closing. I rubbed the scar across my palm slowly. People call that heroic. I just call it the only available option. Rick stared at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not mockery, not confidence. Just a man realizing, slowly and uncomfortably, that he'd spent years making jokes at the expense of something he couldn't begin to understand. Why didn't we ever know about this? He asked finally, almost to himself. Because I didn't want you to. Everyone looked at me. Do you know what happens after enough war? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. You stop wanting to be seen. The evening breeze moved across the patio. Down the road, a dog barked. Somewhere inside the house, a child laughed at something. The ordinary world, carrying on completely indifferent to whatever was happening out here on Aunt Donna's patio. Walter studied me carefully. You still blame yourself, for the ones who didn't come home. I gave him a tired smile. Occupational hazard. You saved 31 men. Not all of them. Walter's face darkened slightly. No, he admitted, not all of them. That old familiar ache moved through my chest. Not sharp anymore after all these years. Just present, like an old injury that predicts the weather. Aunt Donna squeezed my arm. "Oh, Claire." I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was the most dangerous thing. Once people started feeling sorry for veterans, they stopped seeing them as whole human beings. You became either a hero or a wound. Neither one felt real. Neither one felt like me. Rick shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. He rubbed the back of his neck, the bluster completely gone now, just a man trying to figure out what to do with his hands. "So," he said carefully, "why Hades?" Walter answered before I could. "Because no matter how deep into hell the situation got," he paused, "she always went in to bring people home." Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared, painting the Texas sky in long strokes of orange and purple over the tree line, when Walter's expression shifted. Not admiration this time, something heavier, something he'd been circling around all evening. "Claire," he said carefully, "why did you really disappear after Kandahar?" My stomach tightened like a fist. There it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. "Because some things follow you home," I said finally, "and some people make sure of it." The air on the patio changed. "Kandahar wasn't supposed to be a rescue mission," I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted them. Trauma has a strange preservation quality. You forget names, birthdays, phone numbers, but fear stays perfectly intact, like a fossil. Small recon unit, standard extraction support, in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The storm hit early. We lost communications twice. Then the team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Heavy fire, RPGs. 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand to her chest. Command ordered everyone to pull back. One pilot turned around, then another. I paused. "I didn't." Rick said quietly, "Why not?" "Because they were still alive." I looked at him steadily. That's all, it was that simple. The stillness around the table had a weight to it now. What I didn't know, I continued, was what was waiting when I got back. Walter's jaw tightened. He already knew this part. The commanding officer responsible for the failed operation, he had powerful friends, and somebody needed to absorb the blame. Rick stared at me. "You made." A long silence. "They called it reckless," said I. "Violated withdrawal orders, endangered military assets." The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. 20 years and it still had an edge. What they meant was, I'd embarrassed someone important, and that was a sin they couldn't forgive. Walter's palm came down softly but hard on the table. "You saved lives." "Didn't matter." I tried to fight it. "I know you did." The old SEAL's eyes burned with an anger he'd clearly been carrying, just as long as I'd been carrying mine. "After that," I said quietly, "everything came undone fast. My marriage, my sleep, my ability to exist in any room where people laughed too loud or a door slammed without warning." I paused. My ex-husband told me once that the war had gotten more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew what to say to that. Because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly, quietly, like water finding cracks in stone. By the time you notice, it's already too late to stop them. Rick looked down at the table for a long moment. When he finally raised his eyes, the man looking back at me wasn't the man who'd been holding court by the grill 6 hours ago. I thought you were lonely," he said quietly. "I figured maybe you stayed away from people because you wanted the attention when you finally showed up." I studied him. "I know," I said. "No," he shook his head. "I mean that's a terrible thing to think about someone." The sincerity in his voice landed somewhere unexpected. "You've been carrying all of this," he said, "alone for years." For a while, I said, "Yes." He stared at the fields beyond the fence for a moment. How does somebody live with doing that to another person, the general? How does he get up in the morning? I thought about it honestly before I answered. Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things, I said. By lying to ourselves, carefully, consistently, until the lie starts to feel like the truth. Rick didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Then Walter said the words that changed the next 24 hours. He's in Austin tomorrow night. I looked at him slowly. Daniel Mercer, retired general now, guest speaker at a veterans fundraiser. The name landed in my chest like something cold. Walter's voice was even. Veterans Memorial Center, 1 hour down the highway. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I went home and I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid. Fear changes shape with age. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and what people think of you. When you get older, you fear something quieter, the permanence of things. The way some doors, once closed, stay closed. I sat on my back porch until well past midnight, listening to crickets, while old sounds came back uninvited. Rotor blades, radio static dissolving into screaming, the smell of burning hydraulic fluid. By morning, I'd made no decision, or so I told myself. At 10, Walter called. You going tonight? No. You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer. A beat of silence. Sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure. I hate when old veterans get philosophical before noon. Claire. I'm not looking for closure, Walter. Then what are you looking for? I sat with that question, longer than expected. Peace, I finally said. He was quiet for a moment, then maybe it's time. By 6:30 that evening, I was standing in a parking lot outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center, seriously questioning every decision I'd made since Aunt Donna's birthday party. Inside, under warm chandelier lighting, donors and retired officers mingled the way people do at expensive events where sacrifice is honored comfortably at a safe distance. Waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktail. The room smelled like cologne and polished ambition. Flags everywhere. The kind of room where important men received important handshakes. Walter met me near the entrance. You came. Still deciding if that was smart. He gave a faint smile. You look nervous. I'm considering assaulting an elderly general. That actually made him laugh. For one brief moment, I almost felt normal. Then I saw Mercer. He was standing near the stage, jed by donors and local politicians, working the room like a man who'd been working rooms his entire life. Silver hair, perfect posture, handshake after handshake. A younger reporter circling with a camera crew, he wore confidence like a second set of medals. And then he turned slightly, mid-laugh at something someone said, and his eyes found me across the room. The smile evaporated, instantly, completely. Not confusion, recognition, and underneath it, something he couldn't quite hide. Fear. He excused himself from the group and crossed toward us with the measured pace of a man buying himself time. Claire Donovan, he said, calm, controlled, the voice of a man who'd given speeches to thousands. General Mercer. His eyes moved over me carefully. You look well. That makes one of us. Walter made a quiet sound beside me that he disguised as a cough. Mercer's polished expression returned, thinner now, still angry. Still lying. The air tightened. People nearby had begun to notice. Mercer lowered his voice. This isn't the place for this. No, I said softly. You made sure I didn't have a place for it 20 years ago. The lights dimmed. Guests moved to their tables. Walter and I sat near the back wall. The announcer spoke warmly about leadership and legacy. Mercer received a standing ovation before he touched the microphone, half the room on their feet. I stayed seated. Walter did too. Mercer spoke beautifully. He always had. He understood exactly what older Americans wanted to hear: duty, honor, sacrifice, the nobility of difficult decisions. He had the cadence of a man who'd been applauded for so long he'd confused the applause for truth. And then his eyes found our table. There are, unfortunately, Mercer said into the microphone, some people who never fully adjust after war. Walter stiffened. Trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability. Heads turned subtly toward the back of the room. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions that not everyone, particularly those closest to the situation, is equipped to understand clearly. The old anger in my chest woke up for the first time in years, clean and cold. And sadly, Mercer continued, with a small, measured shake of his head, some former personnel spend years constructing narratives around themselves afterward. Myths. Walter's hand came down on the table hard enough to rattle silverware across the ballroom. Heads turned. Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of absolute certainty. The room went very still. Mercer's expression darkened. Walter. You've talked long enough. Walter pointed toward me. That woman flew into a firestorm while you ran, while you ordered everyone to leave. Whispers ignited across the ballroom. You don't know what's yours. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And then a voice from the front of the room. So do I. A man near the front table slowly, painfully, rose from a wheelchair. Older Marine, gray beard, left leg gone below the knee. He looked across the room toward me with wet eyes. She saved my life. Silence. Then another man stood. Then another. A medic, a former ranger. An elderly father holding a folded military cap against his chest. One by one, quietly they spoke. She brought my son home. I was told no one was coming. She carried wounded men herself, under fire. Mercer's posture, that lifelong practiced posture, finally began to crack at the edges. Walter stepped toward the stage, voice shaking now with the weight of 2 decades. The Kandahar operational files were partially declassified last year. People can read them now. They can read what you ordered, and what she did anyway. The ballroom had become something else entirely, not a fundraiser, a reckoning. The Marine in the wheelchair raised one trembling hand to his forehead and held a salute. And the room watched. Some with shock. Some with shame. Some with tears running freely down their faces. I sat completely still. And I realized something strange, sitting in that chair while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. I didn't want revenge anymore. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The fundraiser never recovered its earlier warmth. Mercer finished his speech to scattered, uncertain applause, nothing like the standing ovation he'd walked in on. He left the stage quickly, avoiding half the room. In the lobby afterward, veterans approached me in the quiet, unhurried way older soldiers offer respect. No fanfare, no speeches. A handshake held a beat too long, a hand on the shoulder, a nod that carried everything words couldn't. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." A Vietnam veteran hugged me without saying a single word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand, her fingers cold and careful around mine. "My son talked about you," she wise. Purred before he was killed. I looked down at the photograph. Young Marine, desert camouflage, big, easy smile. "I remember him," I said softly, and I did. That was the weight nobody warned you about. You carry every face forever, every name. She squeezed my hand. He said you stayed calm when everyone else panicked. I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm a single moment of my entire military career, but soldiers are remarkably good at mistaking quiet fear for steadiness. Walter and I stepped outside into the warm Austin night. Traffic moved steadily along the highway. The fundraiser noise faded behind us, replaced by Texas summer air, dust and heat, and the distant smell of cedar. Walter lit a cigarette despite what was probably the firm medical advice of several different doctors. "This is going to move fast through veteran circles," he said. I figured. The community has a long memory. I leaned against the railing. You know what's funny? I spent 20 years trying to disappear. One barbecue and a dropped champagne glass undid the whole project. Walter laughed, a real one, quiet and genuine. Then he grew serious. You deserved better, Claire. I stared out at the parking lot lights for a moment. You know what I regret most, I said. Not the military, not Mercer, not any of it. Walter waited. I let the bitterness isolate me. For years, I convinced myself solitude was strength. I paused. Turns out loneliness is very patient. It just waits until you stop noticing it. Walter was quiet the way veterans are quiet, fully, completely, when something lands true. 3 days later, Rick showed up at my house. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants in the early morning. He climbed out holding a paper bag from a local bakery. Rick, I should mention, normally apologized with jokes, sometimes with deflection, never with pastries. The pastries told me everything. What's in the bag? Peach turnovers. That's serious. Can I come in? We sat at my kitchen table while the ceiling fan turned overhead, and the coffee was hot, and neither of us said anything for a full minute. Finally, I owe you an apology. Do you? I was an ass. Also true. His mouth flickered with something that wasn't quite a smile. Then it faded. I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue, he said quietly. When Walter started, I still thought maybe he was playing along. I know. No, he shook his head. I mean, I thought maybe you were lonely, and this was, he stopped himself. That's an awful thing to have thought. The sincerity in his voice surprised me. Rick had never been particularly good at sincerity. It sat differently on him, the way a borrowed jacket fits. He looked around my small kitchen slowly, the vegetable garden visible through the window, the old truck in the drive, the simple, deliberate smallness of the life I'd built. You've been out here carrying all of this alone, he said. For a while, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how does someone live with themselves after doing what Mercer did? Seriously, how do you get up and keep going? I thought about Mercer in that Austin ballroom, the practiced confidence, the beautiful, hollow words. Same way most of us survive the worst things we've done, I said. You rename them. You call cowardice a tactical decision. You call shame a misunderstanding. You repeat it until it stops keeping you up at night. Rick stared into his coffee. Does it work? For a while, I said, and then one day someone drops a champagne glass. 3 days after that, Mercer called. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring 4 times while standing in my kitchen deciding. Curiosity won. His voice sounded different, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. Could we meet, he said quietly, just to talk? Every instinct in me said no. But there was another voice, quieter, tireder, that wanted the story finished properly. Not for him, for me. We met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic. Coffee and afternoon light and country music playing softly overhead. 2 old people with different kinds of wreckage. Mercer sat across from me and stared at his untouched cup for a long time before speaking. I was afraid, he said finally. Just that. The storm hit and the communications collapsed and he stopped. I panicked. That's all it was. No strategy, no calculation. I was terrified and I ran, and then I spent 20 years building a story around it because the truth was too ugly to carry. I watched him carefully. This was the man I had hated for most of my adult life. The man whose name I'd spent 2 decades grinding my teeth around in the dark. He just looked tired, broken in the specific way that only happens when someone has finally stopped running. I hated you, he admitted, his voice barely above a murmur. Every time I heard your name, because every time I heard it I remembered exactly who I was, what I'd done, what I actually was underneath all of it. The diner was quiet around us, an older couple sharing pie at a corner table, the soft clatter of dishes, normal life, indifferent as always. After everything I did to you, he said, why didn't you destroy me years ago? You had the truth, you had witnesses. I looked at him for a long time. Because hatred gets heavy, I finally said. You carry it long enough, it stops feeling like something you're holding. It starts feeling like something you are. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm not offering you forgiveness, I said. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It isn't something you earn with an apology. He nodded slowly. I know. But I'm not going to keep carrying your weight for you either. That part's done. We sat together for a little while longer without speaking, two people on the far side of something that had lasted 20 years. The country music played. The waitress refilled the coffee. The ordinary world kept moving. Eventually, we both went home. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Folding chairs, bad fluorescent lighting, a coffee urn that probably predated the Iraq War. The kind of place where older soldiers tried to help younger ones stay afloat after coming home to a country that had largely moved on. Normally, I would have said no without hesitation. I'd spent years avoiding rooms full of veterans, too many ghosts in one place, too many languages only certain people spoke. But something in me had loosened since the barbecue, some old, calcified thing. Walter introduced me simply. This is Claire. No speech, no medals, no curated war story, just a name. I appreciated that more than I could have explained. The room had young soldiers home from overseas, their faces carrying that specific exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. A few Vietnam-era veterans, a Marine missing 2 fingers, one young man near the back wall who barely spoke, just sat with his hands clasped and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. I recognized that look immediately. I'd worn it for years. When Walter asked if I'd say something, I almost said no. Then I looked at that young man against the wall, staring at nothing, and I stood up. People hear military stories, I said quietly, and they assume the hardest part is the combat. A few people nodded. For most of us, the hardest part is the afterward. You come home and everyone expects you to simply return, like a borrowed book, like nothing happened. A handful of bitter laughs. But war changes the speed of your thinking, changes how you process silence, changes how safe any room feels for a very long time. The young man against the wall had lifted his eyes. For years I thought isolation was a form of strength, I continued. I thought building walls was the same as building armor, I paused. But loneliness is patient. It waits until you stop noticing it. And by then it's not a visitor anymore, it's furniture. Several of the older veterans nodded slowly, deeply, the way people nod when something names a thing they've never had words for. An older Army veteran raised his hand. Gray hair, gentle eyes. Why'd they call you Hades? I looked down at my hands before answering. The first team that named me said it after a mission went sideways. One of the SEALs explained it afterward. I smiled faintly. He said, no matter how deep into hell the situation got, she always came back for us. Nobody spoke for a moment. No music, no dramatic pause, just truth, landing quietly in a room of people who understood what it cost. After the meeting, the quiet young veteran from the back wall approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous in the way young people do when they're about to say something they've been holding for a long time. Do you really think people can come back from it? He asked. The dark parts. I studied him carefully. Not completely, I said honestly, but enough to live again, enough to want to. His eyes filled, he pressed his lips together and nodded once. And somehow in that moment, with no audience and no applause and no salute, just a young man in a folding chair and a small cup of terrible coffee, something settled in my chest that had been restless for 20 years. I drove home alone that evening beneath a Texas sunset that looked almost unreasonably beautiful. The kind of sky that seems slightly too theatrical to be real, deep orange bleeding into purple, the horizon lit up gold over the flat fields. Windows down, warm air, the radio off. I thought about Aunt Donna, and Walter, and Rick with his peach turnovers. I thought about Daniel Mercer sitting across a diner table, looking like a man who'd finally run out of story. I thought about the woman who pressed her son's photograph into my hands. Life had broken all of us in different shapes. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some by building walls so tall and thick they eventually forgot there was anything on the other side. But underneath all of it, most people were just trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for an extra minute, watching the light settle over the fields, listening to nothing in particular. And I thought about the name. Everyone assumed Hades meant death, violence, darkness. They were wrong. It meant going into hell and coming back out. It meant refusing to leave people behind in the dark. It meant believing, against all reasonable evidence, that some things, some people were still worth the descent. Maybe that's not just a military lesson. Maybe that's just what love looks like in the hardest circumstances. The willingness to go in after someone, to carry them back. Maybe some of us spend years alone because we're afraid no one would go in after us. And maybe the bravest thing isn't the mission, it's finally letting someone know where you are. If this story reached something in you, a memory, a person, a door you've kept closed for too long, carry it forward. Tell somebody. Go in after someone who's stopped asking to be found. The strongest people aren't always the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're just the ones who survived and chose quietly, deliberately, against everything to stay.